Okay, so let's begin. Thank you to everybody for joining on Zoom. And we are going to continue our shiur tonight on Tefillah. So the title of this week's shiur is Can Women recite the Kaddish? And I promise it's not clickbait. We are going to discuss if women can recite the Kaddish. However, we first have to do some homework and go over and review what we've studied in the previous weeks in order to get ourselves back on the correct footing to understand that topic in particular. My goal tonight is not just to discuss women, but also to discuss the history of all the minhagim that revolved around Kaddish and to give everybody a clearer picture of how these minhagim developed. Now, if you're just interested in the too long didn't read, the short story is, yes, women can recite Kaddish, and it's less of a halachic issue. It is more of a public policy issue, at least the way the poskim frame it. But let's now go to summarize what we've learned until now. So last week we discussed the history of the Kaddish Yatom, the so-called Mourner's Kaddish. We saw that before the turn of the first millennium, there was a minhag, a custom for a Kaddish, a special type of Kaddish to be recited at a burial, but not by a mourner, rather by the person, the representative of the congregation. That person would say a special Kaddish by the burial. We then find 200 years later, roughly in the 11th century, we find that a new custom arises where a child in France, the custom arises in France that a child is asked to say a Kaddish every night by Arvits, and they only do this minhag, this custom of having a child recite the Kaddish for chinuch, as we saw in the Masor Vitri. Let me share my screen with you. Sorry, I have to get back in the mood of using PowerPoint. So the Masor Vitri says that this Kaddish is only for the, and on our screen here, we're going to have a map of all the regions we're about to talk about. The Masor Vitri says that this Kaddish is only for didactic purposes. It's only in order to teach your the children how to say Kaddish and how to pray. Around 100 years later, we see that this custom in France evolves into a custom where the orphans, not any old child, but just the orphans, are the ones who say the Kaddish in the shul. My own theory is that it evolves from just the kids to specifically the orphans because people felt bad for them, and therefore they were the ones chosen to get this role. Eventually, what we see in the 12th century in the Rhineland, in Germany, is that the Rabbanim give a reason for it, and they say that, well, a Yasom has a special power to rescue his parents from Gehenna by saying the Kaddish, and it's based on a Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. And therefore, they say this special power is why we have the minhag in order to, why we have the minhag to say this Kaddish. And they say that we say it not after Arvit by night, but instead they say it on Motzei Shabbat. They say it after Shabbat and also on Musaf of Shabbat. Why? Because the Shabbat is the day when the souls are not in hell. And therefore, when the Shabbat is leaving, we want to say a special prayer, Kaddish, for those souls before they go back to Gehenna. So that's the gist of how it evolves into the 12th century. Some scholars, and I didn't mention this last week, but there's two scholars who have the opinion that the minhag of the Kaddish of the Kever turned into the minhag of the Kaddish Yatom. Personally, I don't see that. I don't see that leap. I don't see how a Kaddish that the Shliach Tzibor says at one rare occasion in someone's life can also turn into a separate, completely different minhag. For me, it's much more likely that a minhag that begins with children gets continued into specific children. That's just what sits better with me. That's my personal take on that minhag. Let me just pull up the Masor Vitri one more time. I have this slide here that I wanted to show you guys. Give me just 1 second. Right. Okay, so now let's move on to the 13th century. The Orchot Chaim of Aaron of Cohen from Milunil, who's from Milunil, he says a very interesting thing. He says that because we have this minhag to say, because we have this minhag to say the Kaddish in order to bring somebody out of Gehenom, therefore, because we know that the soul of a person is stuck in Gehenom for 12 months, as per certain Barot and certain Midrashim, it would be appropriate to say Kaddish for 12 months straight. That's the opinion of, sorry for the jumping around, that's the opinion of the Orchot Chaim, who is in southern France. So if I could point here to on the screen, if you guys can see where I'm pointing, under where it says Sarfat, in southern France here, near Italy, this is where we have Jews beginning to say Kaddish Yatom for 12 months straight, and because they know that the soul of the person remains in Gehenom for 12 months. So as we see, the way the minhag is developing is based on the idea. The idea is that the soul is in Gehenom and you have to rescue the soul from Gehenom. Therefore, all of the minhagim around it are tied to that, saying it on Motzei Shabbat and saying it for 12 months straight. But in the 13th century, in northern France, we have the Smak, this Rabbi Yitzchak Mikrovil, one of the Balei HaTosafot. What does he say? He says, you know something, if you do it for the first 12 months, that's kind of not a good look. The optics are bad, because that's going to make everybody think that your father, the orphan's father, is a wicked person who belongs to Gehenom. Therefore, we should only say it for 11 months. And so we see this evolution based on the idea where it goes from 12 months down to 11 months. So that's where we're holding in 13th century France. We have the South, which innovates to do for 12 months, and then later the North decides, no, we got to do it for only 11 months. If you move on to the rest of Europe outside of France, we have throughout other principalities in France and principalities in southern Germany. Rabbi Yaakov Stahl found in I think it was in the Vatican and in the Oxford collections, he found some teshuvot from some very random Rishonim. And the Rishonim there were asked very interesting questions. They were asked regarding Kaddish Yatom, who has Kedima, who has precedence in the synagogue. Would a person who's a grandchild, let's say a person passes away and he has no sons, but let's say he has nephews, or he has friends who are Talmidei Chachamim. Should a grandson of the deceased have precedence over any other person or over a nephew of the deceased? And that was the question they were asked. So in some of them had the opinion that, yeah, a grandson is similar to a son, and therefore he should also be able to do a Kaddish Yatom. And some of them had the opinion that, no, he's not any better than anybody else, and therefore he shouldn't have precedence. So why are they asking about precedence? This tells you something very important. This tells you that in their time, in the medieval times, Kaddish Yatom was only said by one person in the shul. There was never a situation where Kaddish Yatom was said by two Yatomim. Therefore, there were arguments in the synagogue about who gets to say the Kaddish Yatom. That's just the very basics of their question. The basics number two is that because they're saying that the daughters, that the father left no sons, only daughters, that tells you that women were never considered for saying Kaddish Yatom. It would never entered their mind that a woman could or should say the Kaddish Yatom. So these random responsa that we find from the 13th century in Germany and in France tell us that it had evolved to a fairly established state with some fairly established rules, and rules were being written. What's interesting, though, is that this minhag of the Mourner's Kaddish was only local to, and I'll try to point here on my screen to where I highlighted here, the Rhineland, and to Ashkenaz and to Tzarfat. The Jews of Sfarad, the Jews of Spain, or what we would call the Iberian Peninsula, had never heard of this minhag. There were very few communities in Spain that had heard of this minhag. Most of the time, it had traveled down to most of the people who had heard of it through Provence, because the news of it had gone down to southern France, and there were a few scholars like the Rivash and Rabbeinu Bachya who mentioned the minhag in passing. But throughout the Middle Ages, the Sfaradim, or the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, had no knowledge or really no such custom to observe a Kaddish Yatom. Now, as I mentioned, the minhag was in Germany to only say it on Shabbat. However, by the 14th century, we have we have the attestation of the Rebbe of the Maril and the Rebbe of the Maril that in Austria, meaning in the eastern sections of Ashkenaz, they began saying it on weekday also. And what's fascinating about this is, and this is the, I'm sorry, this is the Smak, this is the who we mentioned before, one of the Balei Tosafot. He was from the 14th century northern Spain. This is the Kever of the Maril. Maril mentions in the name of his Rebbe that, let me find it for you. I'm sorry. Oh, wow. Interesting. I thought I had a screenshot of this. The Maril mentions that that in Hungary, I'm sorry, in Austria, the Jews began to say it in the weekday because of a Yom Za'am, because of the time of fury of God. So what does that mean, the time of fury of God? Let me just show you the page in the Maril. He says here, ומה שנוהגים ביש מקומות לומר תדיר קדיש התום, מעת שנתרבה שעת הזעם בעולם לא היו מסתפקים משבתות ויום טוב. What he means to say is that, oh, I didn't press screen share. I'm sorry. Let me just do that. Let's do that. In here, you can see my screen. Okay, so what he means to say is that because there were so many orphans after this time of fury, they didn't have enough Shabbosos in order to accommodate all of the orphans, and therefore they started to add the Kaddish Tom to the weekday. So historians say that the time of rage that the Maharil is talking about is the time of the Black Plague. The Black Plague in Europe caused the death of anywhere between 25 to 100, 200 million people, and the aftermath of the Black Plague, after not even the aftermath, even the prelude, as the Christians began dying, was of course burn the Jews. It had to be the Jews' fault, and the Christians went straight ahead to blaming the Jews. And all over France and all over Germany, many Jews were slaughtered, and there were actually no repercussions. Unlike during the Crusades, when there was retribution for the Jews being slaughtered for the misery of the crusade, there was absolutely no retribution for the slaughterings because of the Black Plague. And this left, for what's relevant to our discussion is that this left so many Yatomim that in Austria they simply didn't have enough Shabbatot and Yom Tovim to accommodate all the orphans. So that's why they had to start saying the Kaddish Tom also on Yom Chol. Originally, they only did it on Shabbat because Aleinu ended with Pesukim, but they apparently they started to saying the Pesukim after Aleinu as well. It's the greatest massacre of this time was, of course, in Strasbourg. If you want to look that up, the Strasbourg massacre. It's a horrendous massacre in France where hundreds and hundreds of Jews were burnt at the stake for no reason other than being Jewish. Completely a blood libel. And honestly, there's very few areas of France which aren't stained with Jewish blood today, simply because of pogroms throughout history, but especially after the Black Plague. So that's so much for the 14th century. In the 15th century, we see the Maharik and we see the Maril, and the Rama recommends, similarly to the Smak that I showed you earlier, we see that they recommend saying 11 months and not 12 months as well. So by the 15th century, this is an established minhag with established rules. Before we move on, I wanted to show you something incredible here in the Maril. Maril goes on to say here, he says, the Kuli Kadishi de Alma Takanta de Rabbanan. All of the Kadishim in the world, every Kaddish you say is only an institution of the rabbis. Aval Kaddish zeh, but this Kaddish called the Kaddish Atom, Lav davar shebechovahu, it is not at all an obligation, even from the rabbis. Hilkach, therefore, yecholin kitanim laomro. Therefore, it is possible for children to say it. And what he's reiterating here is that the Machzor Vitri has a problem. He says, how could a katan say a Kaddish in the shul? Kaddish is a halachic construct. So he replies, no, this is not one of the 7 Kaddishim, which is a halachic construct. This is a Kaddish, which is optional, and therefore a katan is allowed to say it. So the the Maril is reiterating this, and he says, "Ubuuvda derbi akiva huskar gam ken yesh me'raba umehai time anami nerali da afilu agdolim kapti tfei akadish diatom yoter mishar kadishim ubaruchu mishum dekadish habe toseft v'lochoba v'savdi davi tfei korat ruach loorei mibacherim." He said there are grown-ups and adults who think, meaning he's like criticizing it. This started with children, but now the grown-ups think it's that it's an important thing for them as well. He says there are grown-ups today who think that the Kaddish Yatom is more important than a regular Kaddish. I can't agree with them. The opposite is true. You cannot say that a minhag is more important than a halacha. And therefore, the Ma'aril is essentially saying, please don't go nuts for a minhag. Don't argue over a minhagim. Don't consider this Kaddish more important than other Kaddishim. Despite this being an established minhag, this is only a minhag, and it should be treated as such. That's the opinion of the Maril, who is the first one to broadly discuss the halachas of Kaddish. Now, in the 16th century, we have the Jews of Spain begin to hear about it. We find Jews in Turkey and Jews in Greece adopting this minhag, and there's attestations from the Shalot to Shuvot. Also, we find that the Jews in Greece begin to refrain. We have evidence from Arta in Greece. They begin to refrain saying it on Shabbat. Why don't they say it on Shabbat? Because in their opinion, well, first of all, it's like Avelos. You don't want to do Kaddish at home on Shabbat. But second of all, wicked people aren't supposed to be in Gehenna on Shabbat. Only the most wicked people might still be, like the people who were Mechalel Shabbos get to go to Gehenna for Shabbos. So if you say Kaddish on Shabbos, that's like a very bad thing. It's extremely bad optics. So the whole thing turns backwards. Instead of it going from Shabbat and then expanding to Chol, it goes backwards. And now people in Greece are saying it only in Chol and not in Shabbat. And the poskim push back. They're like, no, what are you talking about? If you could say it on a yard site, you could also say it on Shabbat. It's not a bad optics at all. And it has nothing to do with optics. We shouldn't consider anybody to be evil. So just like when they push back 12 months to 11th months to not, to try to defeat the optics and say, no, he's not a wicked, he's not in Gehenna for 12 months, and we're not doing it for that. So too, you have these optics being argued over about Shabbat and Yom Tov. And for that reason, till today, different families have different minhagim about whether or not you say Kaddish on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Additionally, you'll have some families today even who prefer that the Ketanim, that the minors will not say Kaddish, which is hilarious because if you think about that, it all began with the minors. It all began with the orphans. So for only adults to say Kaddish is also preposterous. Regardless, that's just how the evolution of minhagim occurs. And you can't really argue with the parade of time. All right. Now, in the 16th century, we have another situation where the Arizal steps up to the plate and he gives a completely different understanding of the Kaddish. And his understanding of it is that the Kaddish is a zechut for the aliyat neshama of the met, meaning that it's a merit to elevate the soul of the deceased through different levels of a Gan Eden. Therefore, the Sfaradim and Hagim, the Sephardic customs which begin to evolve around Kaddish Yatom have a completely different vibe to them. On the one hand, we find the poskim, the Sfaradi poskim, begin recommending saying it on Shabbat, and the Arizal himself says it. Like it's not right to not say it on Shabbat. Shabbat is also just as good as any other day. And the other thing they say is to say it for 12 months straight. However, in the time of the Chidah and the Shalmei Tzibor, they make a little compromise. Like, okay, well, let's take a break at the end of the 11 months for a week, and then you'll continue to the end of the 12 months in order to give the neshama the entire respite that it needs. So in other words, to clear the optics, you break for a week, but otherwise you do complete the entire year of the yard site by saying Kaddish Yatom for the entire year. Now, in the 19th century, we find the Ben Ish Chai also says the same thing. But now that we've covered most of the history of the Kaddish Yatom, let's go to the 17th century. And the 17th century is our first evidence for women beginning to say the Kaddish. So there's this famous teshuvah from Rabbi Yair Bachrach, the Rav. Was he the Rav in Prague? He heard of a tshuva in his Tshuvot Chavot Yair. He hears a tshuva from an incident that happens in Amsterdam. And there's an incident in Amsterdam where a Dutch Jew, loses his, passes away, and he leaves special instructions that people should he was rich, and he leaves special instructions that his daughter should be allowed to say Kaddish for him since he didn't have any sons. He asked to pay for a minion of people to come to his house and learn Mishnayos, and when they were done learning, his daughter should say Kaddish. So the Rabbanim in Amsterdam allowed for it. Rabbi Bachach doesn't seem to like it. He says, no, if you allow people to change the minhag, then Kolish Yisrael Yaveh V'Bayne Bama. Like every person's going to come and build his own altar. You can't just start making up your own minhagim and changing minhagim. And therefore, he says, let's not allow the whole idea of a girl saying Kaddish. Other Paiskim push back a little bit on this. They said if she's doing it in private, she's not doing it in public, then there's nothing wrong with her saying Kaddish, and therefore the other Paiskim didn't fully agree with the Chavis Yair, like Shvas Yaakov, Ber Hativ. A few other Paiskim said that no, it's okay if she does want to say Kaddish for her father, she can do so. But let's discuss the halachic aspect of this, because the halachic aspect of this is kind of interesting. So I want to share my screen once more. Let's move on to the Gemara this is the Gemara in Megillah Daf Chav Gimel Mebeit. This is a very famous Gemara. So I just want to give some background to how this all works and to why and the technicalities of why and how a woman could or should say Kaddish Yatom. So let's look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the famous Mishnah. Ein porsin al shma ve'en ovrin al pnei hativa ve'en osin et kapein ve'en kurim b'torah ve'en maftirim b'navi ve'en osin ma'amad Moshe ve'en omrim b'kat avilim v'tochem avilim b'chat chatanim ve'en mizamnim b'shem pachot me'asara. Right? All these things require 10 men. Sorry, 10 people, I should say, to be accurate. B'karkot isha kehen av'adam ki yotzei behen. The Gemara says, how do you know you need 10 people for all these things that you just listed? Amar b'chiya barabba, Amar b'yochanan, Damar krav v'niktashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. The pasuk says that I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel. Kol davar shebekudusha lo yehei pachot me'asara. All things which are things of holiness, in other words, if they are expressions of praise, of exaltedness to God, if we are saying an expression of holy, of hallowed to our Creator, any one of those action services have to be accompanied by 10 people. My mashma, how do we know this? We learned it out of a nasmachta from a pasuk. Titani Rabchia Asya Teich Teich Gesev Hasam Gdashim Teich Bnei Yisrael Gesev Hasam Avdalam Teich Eida Vasya Eida Gesev Hasam. So essentially, I cut off the bottom here, but essentially you learn two drashas. You learn Teich Teich and Eida, and you learn from the Meraglim to Kairach that 10 people are required for a davar shebektusha. So the rule here in the Gemara is that for a minyan, that if you're going to do something which is a davar shebektusha, let's say kedusha of the Chazar Shas, or you're going to do Baruchu, or a Haftarah, whatever it is, if you're going to be saying kedusha to something which is Kaddish together, many places can hold Uvalit Tzion as well as included, you would be required to have 10 people. So now, what is a davar shebektusha? It doesn't fully enumerate what a davar shebektusha is. Kaddish was never mentioned in the Gemara as a davar shebektusha. Kaddish is only for the first time mentioned in Maseches Seifrim as something which is used for liturgical uses. And Maseches Seifrim is the first place in the 8th century to mention Kaddish as requiring 10 men to say, 10 adult men in order to say the Kaddish. Now, to be specific, it even seems to say that it's more obvious that Kaddish needs 10 people than Kiddusha needs 10 people, which is just a fascinating tidbit because of the Minhag Eretz Yisrael that they only said Kiddusha on Shabbat and Musaf. However, regardless, you see that the idea of Kaddish needing 10 people only kind of develops post-Gemara, because we don't have this idea that Kaddish is a davar shebektusha. We don't have evidence that a Kaddish is a davar shebektusha until it enters liturgical use and until it gets codified as such by the Brisa and Maseches Sofrim. Now, how does one know that when you say davar shebektusha needs 10 people, that means 10 adult male Jews? So from the Gemara, you would have no such information. As long as the person is Jewish and he has a pulse, that would be enough for a person to be considered part of Klal Yisrael, part of the Eidah. As if you look at the Gemara straight up, it just seems any person who's a Jew could be counted towards 10 people for any davar shebektusha. Now, you must just make this distinction in your mind before we continue. There's two types of minyan. There are minyanim which require a minyan. There are services which require a minyan because Chazal decided, like let's say you're going to say Megillah with brachos or Tanchumei Avelim. Those things only require a minyan because Chazal decided that they need a minyan. And there are things that require a minyan because they're a davar shebektusha. There are two distinct categories of things that require a minyan. Now, the Davar Shebekdusha category, as I just mentioned, the Gemara makes no distinction about this being between men, women, or Ketanim. The Rishonim interject, and they say, the Rishonim say that this applies only to 10 adult men. They don't bring any rayas from the Gemara, but they just suppose it, and essentially they bring different. The Achreinim fill in the gaps. They say, well, Kahal could mean only men, Ada could mean only men. You should learn it out of Kairach. There's all sorts of suggestions as to why it is say that Davar Shebekdusha includes only men. Interestingly, if you look at the Rambam, if you look at the Rush says that it has to be Bnei Bris. Yes, the people with a bris milah, they're the ones who can count towards a minyan for Davar Shebekdusha. It seems that in the Rush's view, in order, he says, to get Hashrat HaShchina, if you need the Shechina to rest on a congregation of 10 people, you need them to be 10 adult male Jews. The Rambam makes no such distinction. He says it needs to be 10 adult Jews who are free. He doesn't actually distinguish between women and men. He just says that they have to be 10 adult Jews who are Bnei Chorim. Now, regardless, there is this concept of a snif in the Gemara that if you have 9 men and 1 woman, or 9 men and 1 katan, you could have a katan, a minor, being mitzaref to a minyan, even though he is not an adult. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's a Davar Shebekdusha, and a katan does, and a woman can create a Davar Shebekdusha. However, they could create a Hashras HaShechina, even though it's not 10 male adult men. A woman, according to some Rishonim, 9 men and 1 woman, or 9 men and 1 katan, could bring Hashras HaShechina, and you can say Davar Shebekdusha for that. The caveat to that is that even though 9 men and 1 woman might be okay, or 9 men and 1 katan, and again, I'm oversimplifying because this is a very complicated sugya. Even if that might be okay, the katan cannot be motzi everybody else, and the woman cannot be motzi everybody else. Why is that? Because the halacha is, and this is from a Gemara in Brachas, the halacha is that a person can only be motzi somebody else, a person can only fulfill somebody else's obligation if he has an equal obligation to him. So, for example, if a woman has an equal obligation in Berachas Hamazon, she could be motzi a man in the obligation in Berachas Hamazon. If a woman is chayiv in Megillah just as much as a man is chayiv, she could also be motzi a man. And therefore, by Megillah specifically, a woman can, according to the Ran, for example, can count towards a minyan for Megillah. But the point is that if you're not chayiv, if you're a katan, you're not chayiv like everybody else. Therefore, you can't be motzi everybody else. And for technical reasons, a woman would not be allowed to say Baruch Hu, and a woman would not be allowed to say Kaddish for the rest of the Kahal. So obviously, if there's 9 men and 1 woman, a woman would not be allowed to say Kaddish because she doesn't have the same chiyuv. It's a technicality. She simply doesn't have the same chiyuv as everybody else, to the chiyuv d'Rabbanan of Tefillah. And a katan in the same way, and an eved in the same way, would not have the same chiyuv as anybody else. Therefore, they would not be able to be they would not be able to be mitzi other people. They would be able to be mitzdarif possibly, but they would not be able to be mitzi other people. Some poskim say that, well, the whole idea of a minyan is always connected to chayva. Like if you could be mitzi, then you could be mitzdarif. But that's clearly not always true. So, be that as it may, that's what we're left with at the end of the day. That there's definitely room for women to be associated with the Davar Shebekdusha, but not in the sense that but the overall consensus of the major poskim is women are not included in this halacha. The Rishonim most of the Rishonim assume women cannot, based on it's a Gemara by Zimun, by the way. They assume women cannot be mitzaref to a minyan. They assume women cannot accomplish the Davar Shebekdusha, and therefore that's the halacha today. We follow what the Rishonim say, despite there not being evidence for this in the Gemara. We follow our Messiah of the Rishonim, and therefore women do not count towards the Davar Shebekdusha. When it comes to minyan, let's say a minyan for Megillah or a minyan for saying Hagomel or something like that, if they have an equal chiyuv, women might count towards a minyan equally for men. It's interesting that if you look at the Ran in Sanhedrin says that when it comes to dying al Kiddush Hashem, sometimes there's a difference between farhesia and bitzina, like if it's public or private. So if you have 10 Jews in front of you, then you have to die al Kiddush Hashem in more cases than you do if it's only 3 Jews in front of you. So that's just a halacha in Sanhedrin. So the Gemara over there discusses what happens if it's a guy and there's 10 other, I believe if there's a guy and it's b'farhesia, right, by Naaman and Elisha. So the Ran says he disagrees with Rashi. The Ran holds because of his gerus in the Gemara. The Ran says that if there were 10 goyim and a goy was chayiv and v'niktashti b'teich b'nei Yisrael, if a goy was chayiv, a goy would also be able to be part of a minyan of goyim. He says the whole thing has to do with chiyuv. If a goy is chayiv in kiddush in dying al kiddush Hashem, then 10 other goyim would be nichlal in this minyan. The whole point of minyan is you need 10 people who are equal to you in your obligation. Well, that's interesting in theory, but in practice, goyim are not chayiv in kiddush Hashem, and therefore we don't have this problem of a minyan of goyim bisman hazeh. So where does this leave us with women? So women saying Kaddish. Now, if you had 9 men and 1 woman, obviously woman would not be allowed to say Kaddish. If you had 9 men and 1 minor, obviously the minor would not be allowed to say Kaddish because the Kaddish should be something of a chayva. However, if the Kaddish was a Kaddish dirishus, let's say you have 10 men and 1 minor, or you have 10 men and 1 woman, and this Kaddish is a Kaddish or just a Kaddish Yasom, and the Kaddish is only a Kaddish Rishus, according to the Rishonim, because this Kaddish Yasom is only a Kaddish of a Rishus, it's only a minhag, therefore a woman can say it, because her chiyuv is equal to everybody else, and you have 10 men, so it's definitely a davar shebek kedusha, and it's definitely a situation where there is hashras hashchina, and therefore they definitely can answer a main and can answer a main Shmei Rabbah to the woman's call. Therefore, definitely al pi halacha, a woman can say Kaddish, and the men can answer a main because there's nothing wrong with it. It's she's equal in chiyuv to the men, and they are also we have hashras hashchina because there's 10 other people. Now, I'm not making this up. This is something that many of the major poskim said, and there's somebody who did a survey of. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna share my screen here. Somebody did a survey of all of the rabbanim who. Somebody did a survey of all of the rabbanim who held this way, and Ruvain Fink is one of them, but also somebody I forgot his name, Joel Wakoloweski or something. He did a survey of all the Rabbanim who mentioned this. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Chafetz Chaim, Rav Chaim Weiser, the Rav, and Rav Yosef Henkin, all of these Rabbanim mentioned, Rav Moshe mentions in a tshuva that in Russia, it was common practice in Russia for women to come to shul, avelim, for women who were avelim to come to shul to say Kaddish. The people who he spoke to who lived in Europe said Rav Chaim Weiser passed in this way and Rav Chafetz Chaim passed in this way. The Rav of Soloveitchik said he remembers davening in the Gruz shul in Vilna, a very from shul, and the minhag was pashut that women would come in to say Kaddish. So we're not talking about some modern Orthodox minhag. We're talking about a very from minhag where women would come, sometimes even to the front of the shul. Like where in the olden days, it was like one person would say Kaddish. Very, very often you wouldn't have multiple people saying Kaddish. So some women would go to the back of the shul and say Kaddish, or they do it from a women's section if there was one. But some women would just go to wherever the man would say Kaddish, right? The man would go next to the Sheikh Tzibur. So the woman would walk straight up. She put on a tickle. She'd go straight up to the front of the shul. She would say Kaddish at the end of davening. And Rabbi Yosef Henkin says the same thing, that this was actually pretty prevalent in Europe. It's a fascinating history to this. However, because of simple prudishness, I mean, honestly, the American culture is very different. So a lot of the poskim mentioned that this problem here has to do much more with public policy. If you look at Chamovadia, if you look at Rav Moshe, if you look at a couple of the poskim who discuss this modern practice, their issue is not a halachic issue. Their issue is really with whether or not the communities are ready for this. Is it sinios? Is it going to be pirates together? You know, so Ruvain Fink, who I just showed you an image of before, Ruvain Fink has this article in, where are we here? He has this article in the RJJ Journal where he goes on a whole thing bringing every authority ever, whoever said Kaddish Yasam by a girl should not be allowed, and he paskins at the end, you should, it's one of the evils, and you should definitely, it's strongly usher, and no woman should ever be saying Kaddish before Hesya. That's his opinion. He's a rabbi in New Rochelle, I think. And he holds very strongly that women should not be saying Kaddish Yasam, and according to all the poskim who said you shouldn't do it. The truth is that he's ignoring many of the poskim who said that it was a common practice in Europe that many women would say Kaddish Yatom. Now, what's it called? the other the other way of going about this is the concern, especially in the 50s and 60s, that there were arguments about mechitzas in shul, and the Reform and the Conservative, the Orthodox shul had this shuls in America had this tension about if there should be mechitzos, how high they should be, and whether or not women should be included in the communal davening. Should you have mixed seating or not? So Rav Aaron Soloveitchik had a whole reverse psychology. He said, we have to allow women to say Kaddish in shul, because if you don't allow women to say Kaddish in shul, then all the modern Orthodox women who want to say Kaddish are going to go to the conservative shul. They're all going to be attracted to conservative and reform. So we have to play reverse psychology on those women. We have to allow them to be egalitarian in the Orthodox shuls in order so that we don't lose them. It's just an interesting thing. And Ramesh is also discussing when he mentions that in Russia women would say Kaddish, he mentions it in the sugya of machitza in a shul. He's like, well, how many people, what situation do you need machitza for? And he mentions that, well, it's common that women would come to the back of the shul and say Kaddish without a machitza. So that is some of the history. I just wanted to read to you some of the history here from a Professor Yafa Aliach. She says that in Eizeshuk, Tzipora Hutner Kravitz, who was the wife of Rabbi Yosef Kravitz, recalled to her that in 1935, when she was 14 years old, her brothers were out of town when her father, Rabbi Naftali Menachem Hutner, the dayan of the town, was niftar. She said Kaddish at the graveside and continued to say Kaddish in both the town's new Beis Medrash and the Shtibel until her brothers returned. She recalled that at the same time in 1935, Gittel Gordon, who was then 18 years old, said Kaddish in the Shtibel. And another townsman recalled that when the girl said Kaddish, they wore a beret and they stood in the men's section in the first row to the right of the Yamid. And Rabbi Yosef Eliyahu Henkin also recalled that in his youth, young women said Kaddish, and he allowed it provided that they stayed in the women's section. So there are from Rabbanim who are very against this because they think it's Pirates Gather. They think it's not Sanua for women to do it. And honestly, some would come to the argument that how can you be more from than these big Rabbanim in Europe, or some would say how could you allow women who are going to sing the Kaddish to have Kol Isha in a shul? At the end of the day, it really boils down to public policy and how a Rav wants to paskin. Essentially, the letter of the law is a woman could, of course, say Kaddish Yasam. The spirit of the law, however, depends on culture to culture. And if it's a public policy decision, every rabbi has to be very careful about how he communicates his public policy, because public policy is communication. And if you say, for example, as some Paiskim said, well, she could only say Kaddish, her voice can only be heard if another man is saying Kaddish, meaning because of Kol Isha, a woman's voice can only be heard if another man's voice is being heard at the same time. We got to listen to those words. A woman's voice is only allowed to be heard if another man's voice is being heard along with her. That just sounds so chauvinist that the modern Orthodox women are not going to like that. And because this is a public policy problem and a sensitive culture by culture issue, the Rabbanim deal with it on a case per case basis. Chacham Ovadia's advice was that if women want to do it, they should do it in the Beit Avel, in the mourner's house, do it among 10 men who are family and close to her, and that'll make most women happy that they're allowed to say Kaddish for their loved one. Another very good etzah for women who want to do it is to go to shul when there are men saying it anyway, and just say it along with the men, because you are definitely permitted. There's no halachic objection to a woman saying Kaddish, unless, of course, everybody in the shul is yelling at you or your parents asked you not to. So with that, we'll conclude our shiur tonight. If anybody has any questions, I'll pause now and take questions, and B'ezrat Hashem, we will continue next week. Let me pause here. Let's